But that says nothing about whether or not religion provides a sufficient explanation for why it's happening or justification for why it's happening. Because here's the problem. In order to assert that there is an all-loving God who is supervising this, and because, I'm not the one here who is claiming that this is being supervised, that somebody is watching this, somebody knows that this is occurring, and somebody's allowing it to occur. If we're going to assert that there is a benevolent being who is allowing this to occur, then it must follow that there is morally sufficient reason for this to occur. In the United Kingdom, just today, we passed 100,000 people who've been killed by the virus. And the Christian has to say that this is morally justified. I'm not sure exactly, well, I know what the reason would kind of look like, which is some form of sound, valid argument in favor of God's existence. If the ontological argument is sound, then the conclusion of the ontological argument is true. It's as simple as it gets. Now, I find this interesting because, it's actually fairly recently that this analytic style of philosophical thinking has been applied to religion, and traditional systematic theologians were, at least originally, quite hostile to the introduction of analytic philosophy to doing theology. And they say that the reason that this is because, religion requires narrative, it requires poetry, it requires this kind of faith-based thinking that analytic philosophy, reason alone can't really grasp at. This I find to be telling, right? We have someone coming along and saying, listen, I am going to accept what can be reasonably shown to be the case, and systematic theology essentially rejecting it on the basis of it not being able to properly handle the content of their beliefs. I find it incredibly telling that when we try to apply this kind of analytic style of thinking to theological thought, the response is never to try and show why actually we can provide an analysis which shows that this is in keeping with our reasonable logical thinking, but rather to say that actually the methodology is inappropriate to use in this case, and we should be using this vague concept of faith instead, which I still haven't heard precisely defined from Bishop Barron, which would be quite helpful actually if rather than kind of talking around the subject as I think we've been doing here. I think it would be helpful to the listener and to me if we could have a sentence perhaps that sums up what faith is as a dictionary theological definition.
Faith is a response to the revealing God.
Give us that again, Bishop Barron.
Faith is a response to the revealing God, the response of the whole self in the presence of the God who reveals himself. Now, that's not repugnant at all to what we were doing 20 minutes ago in talking rationally about God in terms of philosophical proofs. I think those are very effective ways to approach the mystery of God. But then there's the claim, the strange claim from the heart of religious traditions that God has spoken, which means God has revealed something of himself beyond what the mind on its own can grasp. Now, the mind can understand it. It can take it in, think about it. Faith-seeking understanding, etc. But to make it more specific, in the Christian context, we're talking about the incarnation, we're talking about the Trinity. Two realities that reason can't on its own grasp, but were given to us, were revealed to us. And faith is the response of the entire person to the revealing God.
Atheism doesn't claim to have any explanatory power, okay? What we can say is that we would expect if there is a world in which there are conscious creatures, which I recognize some people think is unlikely given atheism generally, but if that's our premise, what would we expect to find? Well, we'd have no reason not to expect there to be all kinds of unpredictable and seemingly arbitrary suffering. It's not me who has to do the explaining here, and you're right, Justin, that during a tragedy like this, you find that people come to religion and people go away from religion. But that falls within the realm, I think, of a psychological discussion. It's like people might come to God because they find it's a good way to deal with the immense tragedy of the suffering that we're facing. But that says nothing about whether or not religion provides a sufficient explanation for why it's happening or justification for why it's happening. Because here's the problem. In order to assert that there is an all-loving God who is supervising this, and because I'm not the one here who is claiming that this is being supervised, that somebody is watching this, somebody knows that this is occurring, and somebody's allowing it to occur. If we're going to assert that there is a benevolent being who is allowing this to occur, then it must follow that there is morally sufficient reason for this to occur. In the United Kingdom, just today, we passed 100,000 people who've been killed by the virus. And the Christian has to say that this is morally justified. And they're welcome to do so with reference to theodicies, by saying that, this is pain. People like to speak kind of abstractly about how pain and suffering might be necessary to obtain certain goods, or it will be compensated in the afterlife, or something of this sort. But we have to say specifically on an issue like this, that yes, this specifically, 100,000 people who have died of COVID have done so because God allowed it. That's the first thing that needs to be admitted by the Christian, and most Christians have no problem accepting that. The difficulty comes in the second proposition, which is that it's justified. This needs to happen, or this should have happened, or at least there's no kind of moral qualm with this having been allowed to happen. That's the problem that needs to be faced.
And can I just, from you, Alex, just understand, is this a major reason why you don't believe in God, i.e. the problem of evil is for you a major objection to God?
Yeah, call it not an active cause of my atheism, but a sustaining cause. It wasn't the reason why I left the faith originally, but it's one of the reasons that prevents me from re-entertaining the idea. I mean, as we've discussed, there are plenty of seemingly plausible arguments to say that there's a necessary being at the bottom of contingent chains in the universe, that there's a being who sustains things, that there's an arbitrary first cause or something like this. But to say that this first cause is a loving God who will preside over the kind of suffering that we've seen, not just in the human context of something like the coronavirus, but also the hundreds of billions and trillions, if you include sea life, of animals who are going through suffering that we wouldn't even be capable of imagining, there seems to be no explanation for this.
When analytic philosophy applies reason to theology, it runs into a wall, not because reason fails, but because theology retreats. Alex is right. Faith gets used as a shield when arguments can't hold up. Systematic theologians themselves were historically hostile to logic-based inquiry because it exposed contradictions. And take suffering, not just human, but across evolution. Over 99% of all species have gone extinct. Billions of animals endure brutal lives, parasitism, starvation, disease, all before humans even existed. That's not just tragic, it's systematic and ongoing. A loving designer wouldn't build a world like this. The COVID pandemic is just one recent example. Over 7 million global deaths, and children weren't spared. Christians say it's part of some plan, but that's moral hand-waving. If a human allowed that kind of suffering knowingly, we'd call them monstrous. It's not enough to say God has a reason. If that reason can't be shown, it's indistinguishable from no reason at all.
Okay, so this is a huge question that we're trying to,
we're
sum
taking
up
on the small questions
here
today.
Yeah, where are you going to begin with this, Bishop Barron?
Well, how about with Aquinas? In the Summa, when he poses the question, "Utrum Deus sit," is there a God? And Aquinas famously puts up objections first, right? Well, two of them we've talked about. One is that nature is a self-contained system. There's no need to go outside of nature to explain what's going on within nature. That's objection one. Objection two, and Thomas states it, I think, more elegantly than anyone in the tradition, and I include the atheist tradition. Thomas said, if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. So if there were an infinite heat, there'd be no cold. That's his example. But God is called the infinite good. Therefore, there should be no evil if there's an infinite good. But there is evil. Therefore, there is no infinite good. That's a good argument. That's an elegantly stated argument. And it's what has been argued for millennia, right? It's the perennial objection. Now, I'm sure everyone here knows the classical response, rooted in people like Augustine, repeated by Aquinas, that God doesn't cause evil, but God is so good that he draws good out of evil that might not have existed without evil. He permits evil to bring about a greater good. Now, can we see that sometime? Sure. I mean, there's obvious examples in our ordinary experience of evils that actually produce a great good. Can we very often not see it? Well, yeah, of course. I'd say even typically we don't see right away, oh yeah, that's the reason why that was permitted. So do we hold as theists that God is providentially ordering the whole of the universe? That, as Jean-Pierre de Caussade put it, everything that is in some sense the will of God, either actively or permissively. Yeah, I think we are obliged to hold that view. Therefore, something like this formula has to obtain, that God permits forms of suffering to bring about a greater good. Now, can we see it? As I say, sometimes yes, typically no, but that shouldn't surprise us, right? If we're talking about not one contingent cause among many, so someone who might be ordering things in one corner of the universe, but of God, ipsum esse, the creator of all things, whose preserve is all of space and all of time, is it at all likely that we're going to see the full implications of whatever is happening, the full implications across space and time of what's being permitted? And the answer there is obviously no. And I think now go back to the book of Job is the classic biblical answer in the presence of great evil, great suffering, is we don't know what God is up to. And we're in no position, now I'd put that back on Alex, we're in no position to say definitively there is no morally justifiable reason for this particular evil, because we need a godlike perspective on all of space and all of time in order to make that claim. And that's the import of God's speech to Job, the longest speech of God anywhere in the Bible. Where were you when I made the heavens and the earth, etc.? But it just means you're in no position to pronounce or to articulate that premise that you have clear knowledge. There can't be a morally justifiable reason for a given suffering. It seems to me that from a purely logical standpoint, the argument's not that compelling. It is filled with emotional power. I completely get it. Like anybody who's lived more than 2 years on planet Earth, I've suffered in my life and wondered why and asked the question. Of course I do. And then as Alex and many others point out, the really horrific suffering that we can see at all levels of a sentient being. Sure, I get it. I totally get the emotional power of that. But it seems to me from a strictly logical standpoint, it's not a compelling argument because it assumes you have a godlike perspective.
Bishop Barron argues that we can't judge whether suffering is morally justified because we don't have a God's-eye view of space and time. But that's not a defense. It's a deflection. Imagine applying that logic to anything else. A government committing atrocities, a parent neglecting their child, or a doctor inflicting pain. If we excuse them by saying, well, maybe they had reasons beyond our understanding, we'd be erasing the entire foundation of moral accountability. Now consider the scale of suffering. Over 500 million years, evolution has progressed through mechanisms like predation, disease, and mass extinction. The fossil record shows no sign of moral oversight, just brutal, indifferent processes. Tapeworms, brain-eating parasites, childhood cancer. These aren't occasional exceptions. They're baked into nature's operating system. If God is responsible for that system, He didn't just permit suffering, He engineered it. That's not mysterious. It's incompatible with the idea of a loving, all-powerful being. And the greater good argument collapses under scrutiny. If you say a child's death from leukemia is justified because someone in the family became stronger or more compassionate, you're using that child's life as a tool, not valuing it as an end. That's called instrumentalizing suffering, and it's something we would reject in any human ethical system. Even the claim that we can't know if suffering is justified is flawed. If we can't know God's reasons, then we also can't claim God is good. You can't have it both ways. Either moral standards apply or they don't. But once you suspend them to protect God, you've emptied morality of meaning.
This, of course, is not. It doesn't need to be framed in a logical way. Of course, the logical problem of evil has been famously made by a number of atheists, but this can also just be seen as an inductive point, right? Because what's being said here, in many elegant words, I believe, is essentially, in the context of the coronavirus, which is how you originally brought this up, Justin, is the claim that it's worth it. We don't know what for, but it's worth it. 100,000 people have been killed by this virus, which, if it is the case that some good was necessitated by the death of these people, humanity seemed to have been getting on just fine for around 200,000 years before the coronavirus appeared on the scene. I don't see why now, all of a sudden, it's now necessary to bring in this new virus to produce some good that everybody else seemed to do without. And you have to turn around and say that the reason this is happening is because it's worth it. And someone asks you, well, what on earth for? What on earth is this worth it for? 100,000 people. Why couldn't it be 9,999? Why couldn't one person have been spared? Why couldn't one person's of suffering have been marginally less? Surely the same kind of goods of community spirit or whatever it is that you think the good is that's come out of this coronavirus could have been achieved with one less person dying. And not only does God turn around and say, well, listen, you don't know what I know. Yeah, just wait and see. He turns around and says, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? How dare you even suggest that you know better than me? How dare you even ask the question? How dare you question that me allowing this to happen is a good thing, is worth it? And you have to look at your dying father in the eyes and say, I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to say that this is a tragedy, because I know that from a divine perspective, the only way to reconcile my Christianity is to say not just that this is some kind of tragedy with an explanation, but no, this is worth it, this is good, this brings about something better. I don't think that's a task that can be done.
Yeah, but who are you or I or anyone to say? How do we know? How would anyone, we'd have to have a godlike grasp of all of space and all of time to make a judgment, pro or con. Neither one of us, no one can make that judgment. And I mean, you can characterize it the way you did in a sort of flip manner, but that God permits evil to bring about some greater good, I don't know what that is. How do I know specifically what that is? Though I can state the principle, I think, legitimately. But I don't know. How do I know? How does anybody know? I think it's arrogant on either side, in a way, to claim that knowledge.
Well, then,
I know that God exists on other terms. So, I mean, I think through various paths and various rational means, I know that God exists. I also know that evil is present in the world. So I've got to find a way to reconcile those. It seems to me the principle achieves that. The details of it, I don't know. How would I possibly know?
Well, perhaps I can elucidate the problem I have with this view by asking you a question. Bishop Barron, would you say, for instance, that it is bad when a woman has a miscarriage or a baby is ripped from the arms of its mother in a tsunami? Would you say this is a bad thing?
Sure.
Well, how could you possibly say that? How could you be so arrogant as to suggest that you know enough about the ultimate reasons for this happening that you can conclude that this is overall, all things considered, a bad thing? The problem is that if we say that because we don't have this divine universal perspective that allows us to understand the exact, complete kind of field of play that's going on here, I'm not allowed to say that actually there's no justification for this because I can't possibly know that, then we forfeit our right to use any kind of moral language because we are never, ever in a position to judge these things. And so we can never say that something is bad or something is good because we don't have that perspective.
No, I don't see why that would follow. I mean, I can say like a moral action is bad. I can say what Hitler did is bad. It's morally wrong. Now, did God permit that? Well, sure, in the measure that God permitted Hitler to come into being, that God didn't interfere with Hitler's activity. So God allowed that. God permitted it. But I can still say it's bad. But does God allow that evil to bring about some greater good that I can't see? That's the principle. But I have no hesitation calling things good or bad.
I mean, earlier on, you said as well, Alex, that you can't call the death of someone's father a tragedy if you're a Christian because it can't be a tragedy if God has some greater purpose in mind. But presumably, Bishop Barron, you would say tragedy exists for Christians, even if we do believe there's an ultimate,
well, again,
reason.
we're probably equivocating a bit. I mean, I would subscribe to Dante's. We're ultimately dealing with a divine comedy. So in that grandest possible sense, there's no tragedy. I'm dealing with a comedy, finally. But sure, within that, sure, from our perspective, we can identify something as tragic or deeply sad or wicked. But God's perspective, God is not one fussy competitive object among many. God's not one little fussy cause among many, but God is ipsum esse, more like the author of a novel than a character in it, right? And so Dostoevsky allowing all sorts of darkness within his great novels, but still having a commanding viewpoint. And it's an analogy that limps like all analogies, but God's more like that than one fussy character among many within the novel.
Well, yeah, I mean, when Dostoevsky allows a character to be mistreated, it's certainly good for the plot line, but it's not good for the character. And that's the point here. The Christian, at least the theodicy that's been proposed here, is one saying that, evil is allowed because some greater good can be brought brought from it, which means the corollary of this is that any time an evil exists, any time bad exists, it exists precisely because some good is going to be brought out of it. That is to say, evil is actually an indication that something good is happening, which means that all of these evil instances, and I specifically avoided using instances that have the complication of free will, so I wouldn't use something like the Holocaust, but I use something like the coronavirus or something like a miscarriage. The implication of this, the implication of saying that evil is always an indication that some good is being obtained, is to say that these are things worth celebrating. Any time that one of these things happens, any time that a tragedy, and of course you can see it as an emotional tragedy, a Christian is still perfectly entitled to say that they're upset by this, that they're sad, that they're angry, that they don't understand the reasons, but ultimately philosophically they have to say this is a cause for celebration. Thank goodness that this has been allowed to happen so that we can draw out some good. Thank goodness that this 100,000 people in the United Kingdom have been killed by this virus so that some good can be achieved.
No, that's an emotional appeal, though, Alex. I don't think that's right. I mean, the Christian would look gravely at the situation and acknowledge God's will is at work here, though I can't see it. I mean, I think that's the right attitude. To say I would celebrate it seems to me the wrong point of view. You'd look at it and acknowledge there's a dimension to this that I can't fully appreciate. I place it within the context of God's ultimate purposes, but I do so, I mean, obviously in a very grave manner, typically in the presence of great suffering. So I wouldn't say that we can celebrate it, but
we can, of course, we can have grave celebrations, right? I mean, would you not say that God's will being done to produce good ends is worth celebrating? Of course, if God's will is being done to produce a good end, that's something worth celebrating. Now, in the same way, if we win a war, if we win World War II, we celebrate that happened, but it's a kind of solemn celebration because we recognize the cost that was paid. But it's still a celebration. It's still a good thing that we won that war. If evil is actually an indication of God's will being done by the procurement of some good through some evil, then as solemnly as that celebration may occur, it should have to be something worth celebrating, which seems to me totally anathema to the way that any person could, let alone should, entertain these kinds of tragedies.
Alex is exposing the core contradiction in Bishop Barron's worldview, that suffering is both tragic and good. The moment you say every evil exists because it brings about a greater good, you're forced to treat suffering as necessary, not just permitted, but required. This leads to a moral absurdity, that the Holocaust, COVID, or a child's death are, ultimately, good events. Not emotionally good, but metaphysically necessary. Let's take the coronavirus. In the US alone, over 1.1 million people have died. Globally, that number is over 7 million. Entire families were wiped out. Healthcare systems collapsed. Long COVID still affects millions. To say this was permitted for some unseen greater good is not just unfalsifiable. It's a claim with no moral accountability. It removes agency from suffering. It denies randomness, biology, and systemic failures. Theological arguments about greater good also fall apart when we look at natural evil, which has nothing to do with human free will. Miscarriages, for instance, are incredibly common, affecting around 10 to 20% of known pregnancies, and likely more when accounting for early losses. Most are due to chromosomal abnormalities. There is no character development, no soul-building purpose here. It's nature running on flawed mechanics. Is this God's design? If so, it's a design that builds life on a foundation of failure. Then there's the evolutionary evidence. Over hundreds of millions of years, life has advanced through brutal selection pressures, starvation, parasitism, predation, and extinction. Over 99% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct. If this system was created by a loving God, it means He chose to make a world where agony is the engine of progress. Even Christian theologians struggle with this. William Dembski, an intelligent design proponent, once suggested that God allowed the appearance of millions of years of suffering for theological reasons, essentially to maintain the illusion of natural history. That's how far one has to stretch logic to protect divine goodness. What Alex points out is simple. If every event is ultimately good, then good and evil lose meaning. We can't condemn genocide, famine, or disease because behind it all, we're told, is a divine hand weaving something beautiful. But that's not morality. That's moral surrender. And it's dangerous. When you strip suffering of its moral urgency, you become numb to injustice. And that's the heart of the problem. This framework doesn't ask us to act against suffering. It asks us to accept it, to trust it. But if we want a better world, we can't afford to excuse suffering as part of some higher plan. We have to name it, challenge it, and work to reduce it, not spiritualize it. So here's a serious question worth reflecting on. If your moral system turns every tragedy into a hidden good, how can it ever call anything truly wrong and mean it? Let us know what you think in the comments. Like if this gave you something to think about, and subscribe for more grounded, honest analysis.